Fantastic. I think we're recording now. So welcome to Bard School Oceania, because I am in London, but Dan is in New Zealand. Welcome, Dan.
Hello, how's it doing? Kia ora, as we say in New Zealand, which means life be with you.
Oh, wonderful. I thought it was a kind of orange juice that they sold at the cinema, but now I know it's much better than that. Fantastic. So today, this is actually the first of our conversations. Dan was and still is, the first librarian of the Bard School, of the Bard Library, which is still in London. And you helped to put it together, Dan, and what a great time that was. And Dan is out in New Zealand, as we said. He's the founder of Silverion, which is a Catholic medieval fantasy camp for children. And it's already in its third year. Is that right, Dan?
Going into its third year now. Yeah, that's right.
Wonderful. And I know you have a magnificent plan for building the 11 kingdoms all over the world. Is that right?
Yep. So we've been granted 11 Tyburn monasteries to spread our medieval fantasy camp. So that's really a dream come true for me. The camp is called the Kingdom of the Holy Spirit, and it's all linked to Tolkien's vision. His whole vision, which I refer to as the sacramental vision, it's a particular way of looking at reality that helps your imagination seek the divine. So we use this kind of philosophy to develop an immersive experience for young people to encounter the Catholic faith, the sacraments, in a life-giving way. So that's really something that's come together over the last few years, and we're really excited to now see it go all around the world.
Fantastic. And just to sort of do a shout out to the fantastic Arcatheos in Canada, which was one of the inspiring experiences that led you to then set up your own camp. So this morning, this is our first venture at recording a conversation that springs off a poem and hopefully opens up into something that people will be excited about hearing. I'll be excited to hear what you have to say, Dan. So the idea of these conversations is that we'll start with a poem that I've written and then just leap on from there. So first of all, I'm going to read you this poem, Dan, that I know you just read this morning or last night, depending on the time. And as you know, we're in the middle of lockdown still, that's supposedly slightly easing in England. We've also got the situation of the death of poor George Floyd and everything that's going on in the world. But I went out in the morning and I just saw the garden, and I wrote this poem based on being moved by that moment. It's called "The Yellow Irises Have Broken into the News Cycle." Please stop the news presenter in her auto-cued perfection and arrest her thoughts with this. Morning is breaking. The yellow irises in the rectangular pool have occupied the central section of the garden. A radical newness never seen before has come upon the world. These tall boletic flowers, high on serenity and wearing nothing but their equanimity, have slowed down all the variegated greens from hedgerow, linden and forsythia, and here, in front of this unruly crowd of reeds, have taken a stand. An ultimate horizon for the human race has opened up before us. For all their sunward petals have been gathering up the light since dawn, and now this solemn and yet jubilant ecstasy of yellow demands to be seen. It's possible that such a sight will never be seen again. So summon Al Jazeera and alert the news at 10. 11 yellow irises have broken into the news cycle with blithe, immutable bliss. And all the pain of rage and death must now remember this.
Well, I'm thrilled that you've chosen that poem because that fits in very well with what I want to talk about. So thank you for that.
Well, that's marvelous. What was your first reaction when you heard the poem? I mean, lots of people might think, oh gosh, well, sitting in your garden, lucky you, that's just escapism. But what came out of the poem for you when you first heard it?
You've got a little line there. Is it undressed, or one of the words that you used there? affordability
something
form.
like wearing nothing but their equanimity, because of course it's calling upon the imagery of protest, isn't it? And yet they're standing in a different way.
But one of the things that I drew out of that is this great revelation. So wearing nothing in a fallen world is a cause for sin, but actually, in the context of original innocence, there's a great revelation where you come to see the thing as it really is. And I think that's part of how your poem is working in this context. If you look at the race divide in America, it's often referred to as the original sin. But a true perception of your brother from another race would have an innocence within it that's now been lost. So that search for that innocence, well, what would that actually be? And I guess what we have to do now is try and look at what a transfigured world would look like. But the transfigured world is at once a memory of what's been lost, but then there's always a hope, at least within the Judeo-Christian perspective that I belong to as a Catholic, that the transfiguration is a kind of participation in the innocence that was lost. It's been taken to another level, because now
it's breaking up.
We have that in Happy Fault. In the
we missed that because the line broke up. So can you go back to the beautiful thing you were saying about the transfigured world? Because then the line broke up, and I'd love to hear that again. You were reflecting on the fact that when the flowers take their standing only in their equanimity, that this recalls in some way original innocence, which deep down we're all trying to find somehow. And you were saying that it's this quest for the transfigured world that we're really after. So can you take it from there?
We're after the transfigured world, but what I was saying was that in the movement towards the transfigured world, we're going to be taken within an innocence that's all at once older than original innocence. It's the divine innocence. And so the divine innocence is what will lead us into transfiguration. It's in the Easter proclamation, Happy Fault, but it's also in the Franciscan mystical tradition that the wedding that God always called us to was a wedding of union with his divine innocence. And so, unfortunately, in a fallen world, we've totally destroyed that image. But with all integration of the transfiguration, what you will see is the divine innocence now becoming all in all. And so that really is the hope, I think, you can see in those flowers, is that you get the eschatological transcendent vision of hope by remembering what was lost, but that in itself becoming a kind of veil by which you can pass through that into what is to come.
Beautiful. And I think that even people that can't articulate that vision get a sense of hope from the perception of the innocent beauty in nature, which is why in a world in which the worship of Christ has largely been lost as a central truth in many civilizations, we've returned to this sense of worship of nature, or the idea that nature is going to lead us into wholeness. But nature itself, as it says in the scriptures, is in the interesting translation of Eugene Peterson, waiting on tiptoe for the liberation of the children of God. And so though nature retains some of this vestige of the light of creation and the creator, some vestige of the revelation of the uncreated light, I think we're falling into a problem when we think that nature will lead us. I think that's quite an important point at the moment. At the same time as we must be stewarding and loving nature, there has been a sense in which we've forgotten the creator and forgotten the transcendent.
Yeah, and that's the danger in trying to restore Eden, because Eden has gone. And so actually the yearning to restore Eden without an eschatological hope is actually going to create probably the opposite.
That's a really important point, Dan, because I think a lot of political solutions that go very swiftly wrong lose this fundamental basis that we have fallen and that we need salvation. The Rousseau-esque lie that the only problem in society are the constructs we put around it, and failing to look at the flaws in human nature itself, means that we don't have to take responsibility for ourselves and instead come up with political solutions which forget the need for
even
salvation
the
within
way
the
that you,
person.
sorry, Sarah, I agree. And I would say even the way that you've used the word construct there shows part of the problem, because you're talking about a construct as an abstraction from reality. But there's another way of looking at constructs, which is they are a participation with the real, and they're actually they're not just a kind of fabrication or a manipulation, but they're an organic structure that reflects what's real.
They can do.
In that sense, they could participate in the transcendence.
Well, that's a beautiful thought. I suppose I was using the term in the sense that it's often used divorced from that, divorced from nature and divorced from the supernatural. Now, there was something that you were saying to me the other day. It was to do with the eye as a window on reality, because under the poet's eye, things can be perceived sometimes in their original beauty, which is why we often look to artists to tell us something about transcendence, and why the poets are the first to be sent to the gulag and the first to be sent to the paddy fields in communist regimes, because transcendence is refused and a false eschatology replaces the divine eschatology. So can you tell me something a bit more about the eye? Because I remember you telling me something interesting about that.
This is going to be, yeah, so this is going to be a small kind of analogy that I'm going to use to describe everything. And
okay,
of course,
yeah,
well, everything that I want to talk about today, not everything, well, I will try and talk about everything because that's what Transcendence is about. But if you look at the etymology of window, so the etymology of window is actually wind eye. Now, this is a fascinating kind of distilled understanding of our participation in creation, which was rooted initially in a transcendent participation, by which all sight is already a participation within transcendence. So I need to unpick that a little bit, but I think Jesus actually does say that. He says the eye is the lamp of the body. What does he mean? He means that the eye is sourced within the light. And so within the light, we see the light. That's actually from the Psalms.
Yes, in your light we see light.
Yeah, and so our own perception is already rooted within transcendence, which is kind of like the precondition for seeing. And so we can only see because we've been given a kind of infinite locus within which our sight then situates itself in its looking outwards.
Yes.
And so, and then there's two ways I want to reflect on that. Because I guess the classical idea would be that your eye is also then like a harp, and you have these strings across your eye. And then as the spirit enters in that divine participation, you can have a symphony to the degree that your harp correctly configures itself to what the spirit's song is. So that's on one level. Now I would say the alternative is to try and cover your eye with as many strings as you can, almost towards infinity, because you don't think there's a spirit. And so you will play almost an infinite amount of strings, but you can never reach infinity, but you'll try and create as many strings as you can, and then you'll play your own song. I want to juxtapose those two options. One of them, the infinity is given to you transcendentally, and your symphony participates within that song that is actually something that you are participating within. The alternative is that you have to create your own infinity with strings that you create and songs that you create. And there's no participation because there isn't a transcendence for you to communicate, let's say. So I think that's a good way to root the distinction that I want to talk about in terms of what perception actually is.
Beautiful. What it immediately resonates for me is that it resonates with those wonderful scenes in C.S. Lewis's book, The Last Battle, where the children and the dwarves go through the stable into this part of Aslan's country. And what they perceive, even though they're in the same place, are two entirely different things. So the dwarves are disgusted that the food is revolting, whereas the children are seeing beautiful flowers and really enjoying it. And of course, that finds its resonance in Tolkien as well, where, you know, of course, Gollum eats the lembas and it's like, ugh, bah, ghastly. And whereas it's actually, you know, the food of the elves, it's something of the transcendent. Dan, we're using the word transcendent a lot. You're also a teacher. Define a little bit transcendence for those who might be thinking, well, what does that mean? Some people may have come across that term largely through transcendental meditation or something, but well, how would you define it then?
I think I would define it that there's a mode of being that is beyond space and time, beyond the conceivable material universe, and that mode of being is all at once totally alien to us, but can also be immanent to us so that we can encounter it. So I guess the concept of infinity is related to transcendence, and at least in classical definitions of the creator is always occupying a transcendent space. What happens within Christianity, the tradition I'm speaking within, is this mystery of the hypostatic union and the incarnation, which is the kind of those two notions are completely inseparable. But the idea that the transcendent is within the cosmos is an idea that is actually beyond human contemplation. It becomes a mystical idea because now you have the transcendent, which is within the universe. So yes. I guess I can't separate. As a Catholic, that then it becomes a sacramental perspective, because the material universe now is imbued with the transcendent, which is truly transcendent. I mean, the Jews have that, really maintain the concept of transcendence. You can't say the divine name. You can't, truly know God. He reveals himself in veiled ways. But then, of course, Christ is crucified for blasphemy because he says that he is one with the Father. He says that that he, will be seen on the clouds of heaven. And he says that before Abraham was, I am, which is, of course, the divine name. So you can see in the mystery of Christ, the beginning of that particular metaphysical sensibility of poets within the Judeo-Christian tradition, which Tolkien, of course, says will have flames upon their head. Why? Because they now see the cosmos as being imbued with a sacramental narrative, and their role is to become truly the harpists. Truly, that's Tolkien's point in Mythopoeia. You can read this poem that helped convert Lewis, is that we will choose the harpstrings from the all. So now the harpist's caress is truly in a symphonic union with the divine transcendent creator. It's truly a participation, is what it's known as, a divine participation. You can't have more of a divine participation than hypostatic union, incarnation, and then, of course, what is known within the Orthodox tradition as divinization. And you get the idea of these things with things like relics or canonized saints, is that truly the material universe has now become a tabernacle in time for the creator. The transcendent creator is now, what Tolkien called the secret fire, is now being spread all across the creation, and we can be illumined by that fire or that light to the degree that we allow ourselves and our eyes to enter into the divine song or the divine narrative, that which is truly being spoken from a transcendent order. So that's one side of looking at things within Judeo-Christianity, at least.
So many things arise from what you've just said there, Dan. One of the first I'd like to pick up on is this purity of the gaze, that the ascetic life is about the purifying of the gaze so that we can perceive and receive exactly what you have been talking about. And I think at the heart of John Paul II's, Pope St. John Paul II's vision of the theology of the body was this redemption-founded view that in Christ, the human person is redeemed, the human body is redeemed, human nature is redeemed. And although, as Pope Benedict says, we have been saved, we are being saved, and we will be saved, we are in the process of being purified and of being saved so that we shall be saved. It is actually this process that you're talking about, because it was only when the other day I was speaking with a young Muslim friend on Zoom, and she was asking me whether we're allowed to make images. And so we kind of ran through the iconoclastic crisis with her of the 7th century. And we looked at why why in Judaism they didn't make images, graven images, so that we didn't worship anything but God, but then why after the incarnation, and this process takes place whereby the hypostatic union, the nature of God and the nature of man becomes one in one person of Christ, the second person of the Blessed Trinity. And this totally transforms the world of art, because now art can reveal Transcendent's presence in the world without leading us to worship art as an object. Obviously, people end up worshipping, in quotes, artists and objects when they lack the worship of God. But getting that balance right is really interesting, because I think she was genuinely worried that as a young person surrounded by digital images, that she was actually being completely deceived by images, and should she do away with them altogether? And I thought that was a fantastic and legitimate question. And we talked about discernment of when things can be used for good and when things can be used for ill. But just to return to this point you brought up about the hypostatic union, we have the feast day of, was it St. Athanasius, not long ago? And I read that he was talking about the hypostatic union because, of course, in the Arian crisis of, was it the 3rd century, nearly the whole church went in the wrong direction, didn't it? And just decided that Christ was divine but not really human. But the great revelation, and we have Trinity Sunday tomorrow, don't we? With the great revelation was that, yes, two natures, one person, and the hypostatic union is drawn together by love, because how else can we understand it? So taking up these themes of the hypostatic union and the gaze, I know you have lots to say about this, Dan.
Yeah, and I want to keep it quite simple if I could be allowed to, but you've brought me in very beautifully into what I see in that particular dynamism. But I think if we go back to Adam and Eve, that's where you actually did have an innocent gaze, at least originally. And so Adam's gaze on Eve, Eve's gaze on Adam, their recognition and an innocence that was rooted in a participation with the Creator's gaze. They truly looked correctly at each other. And then the sin, of course, was what fractured the capacity to see. And then, yes, of course, as a result of that, then there was a veiling that happened, and they wanted to hide themselves because they couldn't gaze at each other appropriately. And so you have that veiling that happens, which is one of the original tragedies for all artistic pursuits from that point, is the inability to see the thing as it is. Because already there's a fractured gaze rooted in sin that blinds the capacity to understand the thing as it is.
And to love it.
And at that point, the whole Jewish tradition is that yearning for the original innocence, and that yearning also for an eschatological transfiguration, because we want to be able to see things as they really are. And of course, the whole Jewish tradition, the mystery that underpins the Jewish tradition is that there is a divine imagination and artistry at play in history that is actually affecting and causing this reality of a redemption. And so there's this notion of the divine art. There's an artistry that Adam and Eve were participating in originally, and they could actually participate in the divine art in their original gaze. Then the gaze was destroyed. But what you see, at least with the doctrine of the hypostatic union, which you can't distinguish from the Immaculate Conception. Here, you're going to get Adam and Eve restored, and that's going to be part of a divine imagination that is so innocent, it's able to gift beyond the original gift from its own kind of treasury, let's say, an even more astounding participation, which is, rather than just a participation of innocent gaze, now the artist is going to enter within his art, and we are going to gaze in him, the other. I mean, that's really unexpected. And you can see that already with the Immaculate Conception, because the Immaculate Conception is obviously a doctrine that is rooted in transcendence, because that grace can only be given to Our Lady, who is free. It's absolutely essential that Mary is free.
Run by the Immaculate Conception again, Dan, because I know a lot of people think that the Immaculate Conception is Jesus being conceived without an earthly father. So just to clarify that, in case anyone's listening who's not clear, what Catholics mean by the Immaculate Conception.
And I'm going to do it with St. Maximilian's language. So the Immaculate Conception, I don't want to confuse things, but it refers to Mary being without original sin. But the reason why Mary doesn't have any sin in her, obviously to become the tabernacle within which Christ is born into the world, but in Saint Maximilian's definition of Our Lady as the Immaculate Conception, there is a kind of hypostatic union. It's of a different order to Christ, because
Obviously,
Christ
yeah.
is God and Mary is not God. Mary is a creature. But
The
Mary
first
Mary is wedded to the Holy Spirit, such that when she refers to herself as the Immaculate Conception, I am the Immaculate Conception, what she says to Saint Bernadette in the apparition, two people speak. She's speaking as a creature, and what she says is, I am without sin. But the uncreated Immaculate Conception is that spirit, the spirit that progresses from the Father and the Son, and also the spirit, remember, that informs that our gaze participates within.
Yeah.
And so when Mary says, I am the Immaculate Conception, it's also the Holy Spirit speaking, because I am is the name of God, let's remember. And it's the uncreated Immaculate Conception, the Holy Spirit, who's speaking. So Mary's the created Immaculate Conception, creature. Jesus, when in his hypostatic union, he's also God at the same time. Mary isn't God, but she has a mystical marriage to the Holy Spirit, such that there is actually a union of her person
It's a
with
profound
the
theosis there, isn't there, that we all strive towards but will never attain.
But Mary has attained it.
Yes.
And so what I would like to say on that
completion,
point, and you have the Transcendence, because she obtains it as a result of the graces of the cross, which are an atemporal event, and so that grace can be given to her before her son is even born, right? I mean, before he's even conceived, that grace is available to her because of the incarnation being an atemporal event rooted within history. So you have already, what you have is that seminal paradox, which I was trying to refer to at the beginning, which is somehow the timeless is now in time. It's beyond. We can't fully understand what that means. It breaks every. It's that kind of the folly of divine love, which has now entered into human history. It's beyond our capacity to communicate artistically, but we've been given it. And so underpinning all of this is a radical freedom. It's very distinct to the Catholic conception of creation, that all of this is in the divine imagination as a free choice, not only the creation, but the redemption, and it's all rooted within freedom. And so it makes sense that Mary, having that grace available to her to be the Immaculate Conception, then not as a robot, but very much in her creatureliness, decides
absolutely
continually to participate. And so she is in essence that first restored art. She is now the artist. Imagine if the artist created, then the artwork became marred. So the artist said, I'll come in and I'm going to make something even more beautiful. And so Mary was that first restoration. But there's so much to unpack there, because her gaze is the gaze of the Catholic sacramental vision. She is the one, to return to that image of the harp, who is now within the symphony of the Spirit. She is the music, let's say, of the restoration. And so you can unpack that further and further and further, but it's always a continual thing. All of this was all at once learnt in a process. She had to go through it in a true historical fashion. It's easy to put Mary into dogmas, but she's also a historical creature. And so you have the whole mystery of history in Mary already. So Catholics are called as artists to enter into the Marian Gaze. And anyway, my whole points on Tolkien is that that's what he was doing. I mean, any good Catholic artist, it's not like a sort of silly dogma. It's actually the metaphysical condition by which they can become artists of infinite worth, is what they're doing. And that Tolkien makes this point. He says, everything I have learned about beauty in its simplicity and magnificence, I learnt from the Blessed Virgin Mary. That's what he means. He means she is the metaphysical fulcrum by which we look at the transfigured world. And people will push that and say, at the cross, Mary is now in this beatific Trinitarian ecstasy, because if you read St. Alphonsus Liguori, Jesus died with no consolation because he was looking at Mary and Mary was looking at him, and in his sight, looking at Mary's agony. And as St. Alphonsus Liguori says, Mary was preserved by special grace not to die of sorrow. Jesus looking at Mary had no consolation, because looking at her loving him so much meant that he died with no consolation, because she was looking at him with whatever it is that she had. I mean, that's truly beyond our understanding.
Infinite pathos, yeah.
Yeah, and so that's the purification. It's the purification of the gaze, is that beatific vision that comes through on the cross, which is the eyes of Mary and the eyes of Jesus locking. And what they're looking at in the abyss is they're looking at the restoration, but it looks like the abyss. So there's the mystery. Even the night is as bright as day. It's all there in that look that has gone. Also, imagine Mary's sight. She's learnt the incarnation by looking at Jesus. All the Gospels, people say, oh, it's a joke in New Zealand. Where's Mary in the Gospels? And the answer, of course, is she's everything, because the evangelists went to ask her what happened, and her gaze had always been on Christ. So she's behind all of these stories, and was, of course, there when Pentecost happened. So the Marian Gaze is the way of the church. That's John Paul II's reflection on the Rosary. That's John Paul II's whole papacy, and a papacy that was really focused on uprooting visions of history and politics that were against transcendence. And he rooted his resistance in a Marian gaze on history. That was his whole thing. It's Tolkien's thing as well.
And thank you for summarizing that really, really powerfully and possibly uniquely, Dan. I don't think I've heard anyone speak so clearly and strongly in the contemporary era of how the Marian gaze relates to the work of the artist, rooted in transcendence, and how that in itself, expressed by the lilies in my poem, taking that stand, gathering in the light since dawn, evokes that desire to restore innocence to our own gaze through the redemption, because it is the way we look at other people that will often create the space within which they can grow. I remember listening to some friends saying that when they're praying for other people, it's important to see them as restored, as resurrected, in their perfected state, if you like, so that the very hope we hold is somehow transferred through our prayer. And there is a focus in the world always, isn't there, with the news cycle and everything, always to look at darkness and difficulty and drama, and we can see why they do, because we reflect on events, but we're not really reflecting on events when we're just immersed in the trauma. And so artists, bards, if you like, are also called to lift themselves up and outwards into this larger vision so that events are contextualized. So I'd like to return to your point about eschatology. And could you define for us eschatology? Again, because it might be a word that some people haven't come across. They might not have come across the word telos, which is the final end point for things. They might not be used to thinking of things in their final ending or in their origin. Remember that Marx even said, do not inquire about origins, which is a slightly disastrous thing to have said at any point in the history of man and of thought. But so to move into why, because of course a lot of people that I know personally, and would look at injustice and think, gosh, yes, let's just overthrow the order. Let's just make sure that everything that's bad gets kicked to the curb, and then surely something spontaneously will arise, the steep will wither away, and something spontaneously marvelous will spring forth. And then, of course, history is illustrated. My own grandmother was in the cavalry of the Red Army. She saw it with her own eyes, that something spontaneously marvelous did not arise. My great uncles were soon hanging dead from the lampposts, and so forth. And it is, in fact, violence that replaced transcendence. And the eschatology of the spontaneous withering away of the state was, in fact, replaced by a statism whose horror knew no bounds. The human person, religion, art was all overthrown, and the collective became everything, and no one gained. So if you can just share a little bit in your wonderful way of making things both concise but also blossoming, tell us a little bit about eschatology.
Well, I think I've got to keep returning to my image that I'm plugging today, which is the two options. You have the option that your eye is a harp and that the spirit is going to come and play a symphony. That's one option. The other option is that your eye is a harp, but rather than have the infinity of the spirit playing through your harp, you're going to create infinite strings and try and play your own song, but there's no spirit. Now, eschatology is the first one, of course, because the spirit is that which is eternal, let's say, in God. Transcendent schemes have a infinite, eternal mode of being that roots everything else within it. And so in that original scheme, eschatology is a lot of things all at once. It's because we can't fully understand what it means, because we are, of course, within the contingent time scale. But if we look at, let's say, mystical traditions open themselves up to transcendence, and then they realize that within the material universe, there seems to be something breaking through. I use this image all the time with my young people when I teach them at school. I say, you've got to imagine you're on an ascent up a mountain. And at the bottom, you have your academic disciplines, which you're going to use to try and find the truth. And then on top of that, you have your philosophical inquiry, which says, I'm going to die, I'm going to suffer, it's going to be very difficult. And there's a lot of, I perceive injustice, what do I do about it? And then you integrate your academic search, and then you get to the highest level of the mountain, which is called religious questioning. And if you look at the etymology of religare, religion, religare, it's to bind and unify, also with a sense of a wound being there as well. And so religious questioning is where the transcendence either happens or doesn't. You're going to bind and unify all your academic knowledge and discipline and your philosophical integration of suffering, evil, death. And then you're going to ask yourself, well, to the question why, to be or not to be, Shakespeare, what is the answer to that question? It's not like a blind, irrational leap. It's at the absolute liminal boundary of your ratiocination, but let's say with the caveat that you've got to integrate it with the reality of death and the reality of suffering, because ratiocination without death and suffering, it can go the wrong way, because that's kind of like the litmus test to see if it's going to be wisdom. Well, let's root this in death and suffering, and that starts, of course, with Socrates, who preferred to die than to lie. And so that's when you had the beginning of transcendence coming through, because you realized that there was something beyond the material universe that was worth dying for. And then you have a kind of proto-incarnation and proto-Christ there, because something's going to break through at the top of the mountain. Now, of course, mountains are always transcendent spaces, at least in the Judeo-Christian tradition, but I think across the world. Why? So. Because they express that metaphysical orientation towards the place where there's going to be a breakthrough, the place where that liminal boundary, where your ratiocination and your wisdom have come to the absolute boundary. And that's, of course, the total misunderstanding about the difficulty between faith and reason is a tragedy that there's a misunderstanding here, because what we're talking about is the absolute liminal boundary of pushing your ratiocination, but then with the caveat that you're integrating it with your wisdom, which is born of suffering and the reality of death and the presence of evil, which is a mystery. And at that point, and this is the amazing thing that I say to my students, I say you have two choices, and the choices are, they're going to change your life. One of them is there's nothing. And that's historically called nihilism, and then if it's really nihilism, then all the other aspects of the journey up the mountain are now no longer real. That's
constructs without a heavenly participation.
That's terrifying, because I say to the children, and actually, and then I say, well, go home, because there's no school. You know, it's a joke, but it isn't.
Yeah.
And then the other option is to say, well, there's something that comes the other way. There is a revelation, an epiphany, a theophany, a breakthrough within time, within the material universe, of a transcendent order. This is what's known as eschatology. It then reorientates that journey towards something that is all at once coming towards us, but also what we're going towards.
Yes.
So it's a kind of divine opportunity or revelation, or all these words try and express it, an orientation towards the divine as well, within which we can now situate that whole journey of going up the mountain towards its true purpose. And because that true purpose is actually the opposite of nihilism, is that there is actually something that comes the other way.
Absolutely.
And
Otherwise, we're just journeying.
I would say religious traditions are the ones that tell you that there is an epiphany, there is a revelation, there is a theophany, and of course, rational thought, at least within Western civilization, is rooted within that revelation of the hypostatic union, the incarnation, and also the kind of orientation towards a transcendent transfiguration of the world and redemption. And so rational thought is all at once unified with that perspective, and I would call that the harp playing along with the spirit, let's say.
That's a wonderful vision. I just want to bring it back into relationship now, because the implication for relationship, the implication for political action, is that always one must be bearing in mind, when perceiving another person or perceiving any situation, that they are also this bearer of the divine image. So, and this will change the way we treat people, the way we talk to people. I love that essay by C.S. Lewis, The Weight of Glory, weight as in W-E-I-G-H-T, the weight of glory. And he finishes that essay saying that, next to the tabernacle, there is no one holier. Next to the host in the tabernacle, there's nothing holier in the world than your neighbor. And this is a real transfigured way of seeing people. And also, if men and women relate to each other, always striving to perceive the presence of the person in their eschatological and final state, it will take away from those relationships the Marxist overlay, which is the war between the sexes, the war between the classes, and replace it with what Pope Benedict talks about, which is the restoration of the encounter in the garden of the resurrection. That's what we're after. We're after this encounter in the garden of the resurrection, because we are redeemed.
And actually, and Sarah, I would argue personally that post-modernity would only be possible as a kind of vestigial Christianity, to the degree that what post-modernity is trying to say is, I want that infinite perception, but the error is to try and root it within only a material universe without transcendence.
Absolutely right, which is why identity politics has become such an obsession with people, the idol against which all must break itself.
Well, the image that I've juxtaposed to the spirit playing through the harp is that rather than there being a spirit, I will try and create ad infinitum strings that I will play upon to play the symphony that I think is true, something like that. So because there isn't a transcendent scheme anymore, all I can do is yearn for infinity by creating, and obviously you can't create infinity.
Exactly.
You can try, and the way that you try is that you try and say that your perception has an infinite variety, but of course that's not possible unless there truly is an it's a memory of that infinity. It's a memory of that of that particular mode of existence. But it's fraught with danger, and I would say is the beginning of chaos, because there isn't actually the transcendent basis, but there's a memory of it, and so the memory goes quickly, and then there isn't actually anything that you can hold fast to.
But Dan, this is exactly why, as soon as you set up any kind of communist or statist regime, fascist regime, communist regime, does it even matter? Or even you set up an abusive capitalist regime in which everybody measures and controls you and creates a different kind of personally invasive idol to control the psyche of people. Wherever you get that, you get people wanting to worship, or worship is demanded of them. So you have the image of the dictator, the Führer, or the communist leader in every home, in by obligation. If you read the books about North Korea, if you study any statist regime, it is worship that is demanded of the leaders. And where art takes up the wrong place in society, in a society denuded of authentic transcendence, you immediately get jokes made. So brands replace it. So you get pop idol, you get these celebrities who represent those figures of transcendent and mythic reality that the human person longs for. But of course, it's totally empty ultimately, and we all know that. But no one is expressing enough, I think, clearly enough, the way the artist who worships, not just meditates and allows peaceful thoughts to come in and distracting thoughts to leave them, but who worships is receiving something from the top of the mountain that will break in through kindness into the world, but must encounter suffering in order to be purified, so that gaze is a realistic gaze, because we make ourselves suffer, the world makes us suffer, other people make us suffer, and our suffering has to be transcended by and purified by love. So you were reflecting earlier, when we had another conversation, Dan, within the world of the Lord of the Rings, about the relationship between Tom Bombadil and Goldberry.
Sarah.
Yes.
Yeah.
Our internet connection has become a bit unstable.
No, it's fine. It's fine. I've got the point, and I think it's the perfect way to end, really. And I want to bring this point out now, because you've talked about love, you've talked about suffering, you've talked about yearning for transcendence, and I would juxtapose Tom and Goldberry, but I'm going to bring in Frodo as well.
Yeah.
Because
okay.
let's start with Frodo. Frodo's the kind of thing you're talking about the purification, and Frodo is the kind of priest character who's going to be wounded by his encounter with sin to the absolute liminal boundary of woundedness. Hope beyond all endurance, hope unquenchable are those Welsh names of Frodo and Sam that Gandalf uses in Sauron Defeated in footnotes to his wonderful masterpiece. So Frodo will get the purified gaze through a kind of encounter with the demonic, an encounter with that which has been stripped of its dignity, and he's going to be wounded beyond understanding, and then he's going to achieve some kind of transcendent understanding when he goes off to the Grey Havens. You've got that, but
that's
I actually
think, really,
and that's holiness, and that's very important. That for Tolkien, the transcendent does break through when the eagles come. And so at that liminal boundary, he's literally going up a mountain, right? And the answer isn't nihilism for Tolkien, although he had the option from his own biography, because he saw all his friends die, he saw the war, he saw the evil, unbounded evil, and he saw the reality of these materialist doctrines causing carnage. But actually, the eagles do come, and that's an absolute central point, is that the eagles come. That's the transcendent scheme breaking through. He calls it eucatastrophe, he calls it evangelium, he calls it hope poignant as grief. That's what's happening for him. And he also calls it luck, which I enjoy. He calls it luck. Wasn't it really lucky that the eagles came? And I think that's really good as well, because that shows the freedom of it, the mad freedom of it. Oh, it's just completely lucky. Of course it was very, very lucky. So that's Frodo. But the bit that people miss is Tom and Goldberry, I think, because Tom and Goldberry actually
and they
have
missed
the
out
love
those films altogether, weren't they? It was almost like they couldn't get their heads around them.
And I've devoted a lot of time on Tom and Goldberry. I've always, since I was a young person, I remember reading Tom and Goldberry.
Not so old now,
Well, anyway, before my GCSE exam, I read Tom and Goldberry, and I remember having a kind of mystical rapture. Not to over-exaggerate, I knew that this was God, strangely. I know that sounds like a heresy, and it sounds like a kind of provocative statement, but it was actually an innocent encounter. I wasn't trying to make a point. I wasn't trying to be clever. That was my first encounter with God, and I knew that God was real, just through Tom and Goldberry, and that's marked everything that I've ever done since. But anyway, The point with Tom and Goldberry is they have that love that Frodo ends up with, but they haven't actually changed their state. So let's remember where they're encountered. So the hobbits are running away from demonic wraiths. They're being chased through the wood. The forest is obviously a very important image. They're being chased through the forest by demonic wraiths. And then Tom is out on a procession of love. Out he goes. What is he doing? He's in this kind of infinite devotion towards Goldberry. And the hobbits just run into it. It's a refreshing song. It's something clearly transcendent, clearly ecstatic in the true sense.
Yes.
And if we look at Tom never, the elves have a participation with the transcendent, but they are creating in such a way that there is an abstraction. The thing with Tom is he never abstracts. He's truly in a perfect contemplation, such that the thing in and of itself isn't changed at all, is actually perceived as it is. And so we can see that.
Yes,
and we can see that Tom is in a completely different space. He's inhabiting a different space. I play a little game of Tolkien models that you paint them and all that kind of thing. And they do actually have Tom and Goldberry as those models. And on these Facebook social media posts, I see it every day. Tom and Goldberry are basically God. They can't attack. They can't attack in that game. All they can, and they don't. Their statistics are all question marks. And all they can do is sing. They have a refreshing song, and so they're useful and useless. There are a lot of things. They're kind of the most useful by being the most useless. Let's say.
This is a beautiful introduction to Trinity Sunday, Daniel.
Yeah,
I have to say.
I'm getting to Trinity Sunday. That's the point I'm getting to, because Tom is out on a procession of love. And if you look at Tom historically, in the biography of Tolkien, it's actually a toy that goes down the toilet in his family called Tom Bombadil. But over a process of an intricate biography where he's obviously trying to appease his family and be a peacemaker, let's say, using his creative genius, and then truly loving his wife within a sacramental marriage, she converted to Catholicism. He's sublimated that whole experience into, and actually he says that Tom Bombadil was always there from the beginning, a bit like me when Tom was always there from the beginning. That whole process of trying to say who Tom is obviously, it does find its place in the masterpiece of the Lord of the Rings, and in a very simple way, it is also his wife Edith, that's Goldberry, and is he Tom? Well, who knows? And when people write letters to him, he remains enigmatic to the point of being tantalizing. And he's obviously enjoying himself by being enigmatic. And actually, if you look at the story of Daniel in the Bible, there's a lot of, in the story of Daniel, the enigma is part of the divine communication. There's a sense in which there's someone who needs to come and interpret truly the dream and the vision.
Yes.
And that's, of course, what the hobbits do. Let's look at the hobbits. They encounter Tom on a procession of love. He's going to gather water lilies. He doesn't care what's going on because he cares so much what's going on. There's that's the paradox. He doesn't care what's going on.
The ultimate contemplative warrior, in a sense.
Because he cares so much about what's going on, he doesn't care about what's going on. Because our capacity, we can only think in a fallen state about what care is. And of course, at the Council of Elrond, the most caring thing to do is go on a war against Sauron using military might. But Gandalf, who's the servant of the secret fire, when all of that's happened, he goes back to Tom, who's the master. Master of what? Master to servant. What's going on there? And lots of people will
Master of the wood. Master of wood and water.
And it's never as basic as...
He's not affected by the ring. Let's remind people, he's not affected by the ring of power.
But it's not as basic as saying, well, he's Eru Ilúvatar, or he's what. We're in an enigma, and I think it's important to keep it as an enigma, but to know the context of enigmas within our tradition. They are supposed to, I love Chagall's paintings. Chagall is working with enigmas. That's what he's trying to do, and we're going to get the transcendent scheme through the enigma. Anyway, Tom's on a procession of love. They're being chased by demonic wraiths. And then taken into that refreshing song, he brings within the procession of his spirit, and there's a spirit that he is embodying. He takes us into the home of Goldberry, who says, "Let us shut out the night."
Oh, my favorite line.
Yeah, I know. And if you look at the poetry that builds up to Tolkien's masterpiece, it's all about Tom perceiving Goldberry. That's what it's always about. And she is worthy of infinite perception. She is infinitely perceivable. She is a beloved that is innocent and worthy of all time, space, and perception. And Tom is more logos, let's say. Tom is more logos because he is the one who is correctly contemplating that which is.
Yes.
And there's an interplay and there's a communion as soon as they come into each other's presence. And obviously it's just him and his wife laying the table for his children, who are obviously like hobbits. You can look at it on a very base,
The lyric
not base,
of the domestic.
there's a very simple domestic thing, but obviously in England, Walsingham, the domestic is the place of joy and transcendence. So he has sublimated that experience of very basic things into the highest, in my view anyway, that's what's going on. And he doesn't even know that that's what's going on because it's obviously beyond. He doesn't want to say that's what it is because you can't represent the triune mystery of dynamic communion because it's beyond words. But obviously, if you're in a good sacramental marriage, that's actually what you're doing, whether you like it or not. And so in he comes through the door in constant devotion and procession. Goldberry is waiting. That's always the line. I think,
Goldberry is waiting.
Isn't that the summation of history? Goldberry is waiting, and she's been waiting.
But also Rosie Cotton is too when he gets home. Do you remember when Sam gets home? She's waiting as well.
And you have, like in biblical literature, you have all these types kind of coming against each other, and the domestic and the transcendent are always in interplay. But
yeah, exactly.
How long has Goldberry been waiting? Well, of course, in the biblical literature, wisdom dances at the beginning of creation. So she's been dancing all that time. She's been infinitely perceivable all that time. And she's waiting for the summation of all things, that kind of eschatological goal, when, of course, the hobbits and the whole of Middle-earth will be redeemed and restored. And let's remember that that's exactly what happens in her house, because in her house, they dream and they have visions of their destiny. And so that's what I've come to know about Tom and Goldberry. It's a bit like, if you look at the Rublev icon, for example, I've mentioned divine wisdom in the master, which is a biblical image of creation. But you also have things like artistic expressions of this dynamic communion between, I would say, the two persons, but then also the spirit that's between them. Because the spirit that's between them is what gives the visions and the dreams to the hobbits. And it's all of that that's happening. It's a bit like a Rublev icon. If you look at a Rublev icon, you're sort of assailed. You're sort of assailed by their gaze. You're assailed by the intercommunion of their dynamic relationship, and you're invited into it.
Yes.
And of course, that's what happens to the Hobbit. You can think of the Hobbits. They actually describe it like this. They're saying, she's on that side of the table, he's on this side. They're dancing, they're weaving, the food's turning up. It's eschaton, it's joy, it's a super abundant love. It's innocence restored, but it's not like the innocence ever went for these people. That's where the refreshing comes, because they're all at once immanent and transcendent, and interpersonal and dynamic, and they bring dreams and visions. And of course, when the Barrow-wites come later, they perform exorcism. At least Tom does, and he goes back to Goldberry. They perform exorcism. So you have, and that's how I'd like to finish, is you kind of have, in that encounter with Tom and Bombadil, the kind of womb of success of the narrative. It was missed by Peter Jackson because it's too enigmatic. But obviously the enigma is supposed to point you towards something which is very important.
Yes, and he put lots of beautiful things in, but he missed out the key. And he missed out the scouring of the Shire because he didn't understand that either.
Which is actually the fruit, it's actually the fruitfulness of, let's say, that innocent womb that they entered into and then went out from, is then will enable them to not only have the luck of, destroying the ring,
Providence,
then also to actually take, like all good Jews and Christians are trying to do, to cast out the devil everywhere, absolutely everywhere. Why? Because Goldberry
and from within ourselves.
Because Goldberry is waiting. Why are we doing all this? Because Goldberry is waiting. There's that yearning. St. Paul talks about it. The whole of creation is yearning for that. For God. Well, I'm using the language of Tolkien, but what? Marian Gaze, sacramental, transcendent breakthrough. All of this is all at once Tom, it's Goldberry, it's it's the spirit that is between them, the spirit of love that's between them. We are part of that. If we want to, that's where I want to kind of finish. I want to just return to that experience I had with a child. But Marian Gaze upon the Logos, and the Logos breaking through, and that divine art, and our participation within that divine art, It's all different ways of looking at this relationship between Tom and Goldberry and the spirit between them, and that kind of refreshing innocence. It's what Chesterton always argued for. He said, look, let's be honest, when you grow up, what does that even mean? Because the Eternal Father is older than we, and he puts the light in the eyes of the newborn child. So if we're going back to him, what does it mean?
Didn't he say that their father was younger than we, not older?
Younger. That's what I tried. That's what I meant. I mean, that's what I was saying.
I thought
the
that's
Eternal Father is younger than we. So what does it mean to grow old? And that's the point. The innocence that has always pre-existed, the willful and free creation, and even in the divine, in the Franciscan tradition, that divine mystery wanted to wed us just for the hell of it. You know, not even because of sin, but just because, and unfortunately because of sin, we then did that to divine innocence. But that whole structure is and that whole free gift is now going to be, it needs to be completed because Goldberry is waiting.
Daniel, in order to sew that beautiful thing up, I'm going to return to where we began, because I think that's a nice way of doing things. And in the light of all that you've said and all we've reflected on, I'm going to read the poem in order to close, because I like refrain within poems, and I like refrain within a conversation, because there will be other lights that now come through the poem from where we began. That's how I want to bookend each of these conversations that I'm going to be having. So just to say thank you so much for sharing so much of your thought, your procession of love, enthusiasm, and I really look forward to maybe having another of these conversations, because there's another poem that I'd love to have a conversation with you about at some point, called The Universe Was Not at Home, which is of course a Jewish line from Rabbi Abraham Heschel, which gives this same idea that the universe is not at home yet, because it is also in procession. It is returning home from exile, a very Jewish thing, returning back to God.
And Sarah, if I could just have my final word before yours.
Please.
Why is all of this important? Sarah, it's important because Goldberry is waiting, Sarah. Goldberry is waiting. How hard is it to wait, Sarah? How hard is it to wait? And of all the people who are innocent, beautiful, beyond measure, Goldberry is waiting. So we better get on with it.
Amen. Thank you for a fresh motivation, Dan. So God bless New Zealand, God bless England, and here's the last reading of the poem. This came to you as the first conversation online of the Bard School Oceania, and I'm most excited to have another one. And I've now got to learn how to upload it. This is all new to me. So anyway, let's finish with the poem. Thanks so much, Dan, for spending part of your evening with us. And I was having second breakfast with you. So it's been my delight, and I'll just read the poem once more. The yellow irises have broken into the news cycle. Please stop the news presenter in her auto-cued perfection and arrest her thoughts with this. Morning is breaking. The yellow irises in the rectangular pool have occupied the central section of the garden. A radical newness never seen before has come upon the world. These tall, balletic flowers, high on serenity and wearing nothing but their equanimity, have slowed down all the variegated greens from hedgerow, linden and forsythia, and here, in front of this unruly crowd of reeds, have taken a stand. An ultimate horizon for the human race has opened up before us. For all their sunward petals have been gathering up the light since dawn. And now, this solemn and yet jubilant ecstasy of yellow demands to be seen. It's possible that such a sight will never be seen again. So summon Al Jazeera and alert the news at 10. 11 yellow irises have broken into the news cycle with blithe, immutable bliss. And all the pain of rage and death must now remember this. And I have to say, Dan, I couldn't help thinking while I was reading that of the yellow butter placed on the table by Goldberry for the Hobbit.
The yellow boots of Tom Bombadil. And further, Sarah, what came to me was, of course, let us shut out the night is morning is breaking. but it's also morning is breaking. The rays
yes,
are causing mourning, the other
yes,
sense of mourning. And so shutting out the night because morning is going to come and because morning is going to end. All that kind
yes,
of play with language. I
beautiful.
wasn't sure which sense of mourning you had, but I think both work.
Both work really well. And I love that interpretation, Dan. And I think, you know, that one of the reasons why this great text of The Lord of the Rings is so popular with so many is it's as close as people get in their hearts, in their instincts, to a kind of participation with a mystical reality, because there is so much in it. I remember when I was teaching.
Why, Sarah? Why? Because Tolkien's rooted in the Marian Gaze. And guess what?
Absolutely.
Marian
And in the
Gaze is so
Eucharist.
subtle. Marian Gaze and the Eucharist, which is also very subtle, that it's so easily missed. And of
Yeah,
course, where's Mary in the Gospel? She's everything.
yeah, she's everywhere.
Everywhere.
There was one thing I wanted to just mention, actually. When I was teaching primary school, which is such an absolute joy, I used to take all kinds of music in for the kids to dance to, just for the joy. I was asked to teach religion, poetry and drama. And I tried to teach as much of all of those subjects in the gym, which the head teacher was very happy to let me do. So we had all kinds of kids leaping off frames going, "Come, my friends, it's not too late to build a newer world." And they were rowing on the gym benches in the newer world. It was just marvelous. Anyway, one day they'd been dancing to the Mozart's Requiem in the dark or something. Health and safety cast to the four corners of the earth.
Or how I call it, Sarah, elf and safety.
Elf and safety. I love it. Fantastic. Well, anyway, one day there was this absolute darling child, and she said, "Oh, can I bring in my own music, miss?" And I said, "Yeah, of course you can. Come on, bring it in." So she brought in Enya dance to. Remember that very kind of, I don't know, was it early 90s kind of Celtic kind of, you know, dreamy, wishy-washy stuff.
Sarah, can I make a point? Can I quickly make a point?
Yes.
Thank you.
Shall I finish my story first and then you make the point? Will you remember it?
Related to Enya. So you make your point and I'll finish with Enya. One of us has got to finish. We're going to be caught in an infinite perception, Sarah. We'll never end.
God have mercy on us. So look, so basically, so she brought in her Enya, and then the children started dancing around to it. They'd been dancing previously to Mozart, and suddenly she stopped dancing. And I said, Claudine, what is the problem? You can't forget children like that, can you? So what's the problem? She said, well, miss, she said, the thing is, there's just not that much to dance to. And I just thought it was such a superb point. And I said, well, I'm glad you enjoyed dancing to what there was of it. But she could see for herself that there was just like a lack of being in what they were dancing to. You don't need to tell children stuff. You just let them dance to it and they soon find out. There's this depth of beingfulness and soulfulness that they long to participate in. And this is why it's so important to share things of glory with them. Your point, Dan, you were going to make.
However, there is one Enya song which is a collaboration with the lady who did the Elvish in Tolkien. And so at that point, she develops her own language, which is quite kind of.
What do you mean, the lady who did the Elvish and Tolkien? What do you mean by that?
For the films, working out all the systems and all that. That same lady developed her own kind of language to talk about the experience that she was having, and then she wrote a song called "The River Sings," which I would argue, and I'll leave that to the people who've watched this video. Go and listen to that, research it a little bit. I see that's about as close as you can get to Goldberry.
Enya. Sorry, Enya. Respect to all.
No, and let's not do that. But from my own perspective, anyway, having said what you said, go and listen to "The River Sings" by Enya. That is a song about the river daughter, I would say. It gets the transcendence, and of course, what happens to Tom Bombadil? He goes to the river, and then he drowns within it, but then she tumbles out with him. You know, it's all that kind of thing going on. But the river daughter. The river daughter Goldberry, who's waiting for us. Let's call it a day there. But if you listen to "The River Sings" by Enya, that will give you a good idea of what we've been talking about today.
Marvellous. Well, thank you, Dan. Lots of love. Hope to see you again. God bless.
Take care. Until next time.